right. Well, hello, everyone. It is good to be here. I know we've been trying to schedule this hour for a long time, but I'm excited to be with you guys. For years, I've worked with college students. I was on staff with Crew for about 16 years and became a Christian in college, and my wife did as well. And so we have a huge heart for college students, and so it's always a joy to be here. And it's in many ways, it's more fun to be here than to be teaching in a Christian context where you just talk amongst ourselves all the time. And so, so today we're going to talk a little bit about. I don't know if you usually do this, but we're gonna begin our time with a Bible study and walk through Paul on Mars Hill. But you need to know that I'm not actually a Bible teacher. So I teach philosophy. I'm a philosopher, and just to complain for a few minutes, we philosophers, you probably don't meet a lot of them, although I know you had Dr. Lofton here a few weeks ago. But we're kind of, an odd bunch, and we kind of get a bad rap sometimes. And there's kind of this idea that we offer this worldly good. We're not engineers and things like that. And, the idea is that we sit around and ask goofy questions like, how many angels can stand on the, head of a pin, or, what was the best thing before sliced bread, or whatever, just silly questions. And even in the day of the golden era of philosophy, when the Greeks, so Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, even then, philosophers were made fun of. And we just suffer from this image problem. One of my favorite plays, actually, is a Greek comedy called The Clouds by a Greek poet named Aristophanes. And in this story, you have the philosopher Socrates, who appears in this play, of course, in a toga, and he's hanging in a basket on a tree, and he's traversing the air, whatever that means in Aristophanes' words. And he has him asking questions, silly questions like, how many times the length of its legs does a flea jump? These are what the poets think the philosophers sit around and talk about, things like that. And so we kind of get a bad rap. And it's not just out there, though. In the world, even the church doesn't always know what to do with us. They kind of think we're a gadfly that asks annoying questions at Sunday school or something like that. Or if they think that you're intellectual, that therefore your faith is so dry that you can let a match on it. And there's all these things, I'm complaining, I know. But then there's the jokes. If you guys, there's lawyer jokes. Well, we hear philosophy jokes. Since you guys are all eating, it reminds me of probably my favorite joke. But it's not really a laugh out loud joke. But it hits so close to home that it is my favorite joke. And it's the joke, what is the difference between a pepperoni pizza and a philosopher? And the answer is that one feeds a family of 4. And so you can think about that for a minute. So yeah, it's a good joke, and it hits so, us poor philosophers. So all right. Now actually philosophy is really important. Here's the thing, you guys are all philosophers, right? Because you're all thinkers, and you already have views about God and the world and yourself and things like that. So really, you don't have any choice on whether you're going to be a philosopher. The only choice you have is whether you're going to be a good philosopher and a good thinker. And so part of what I want to do today is help you be a good thinker, a good philosopher. Now, why am I talking about my own sad story? Well, it's not just philosophers that have an image problem, right? Christianity today suffers from an image problem. And it's interesting, we live in the 21st century, and there's all this interest in religion. In fact, in many ways, religion is it my cord that keeps doing that, do you think? I don't know. In many ways, religion dominates our headlines today. But also, we often, especially in the West, we live in a post-Christian, people say, sometimes it's an anti-Christian or a sub-Christian culture. But here's the reality. Many people, including those in the church, are out of touch with the reality of Jesus. And we're largely sensate and anti-intellectual. And so as a result, the Christian voice is muted in our culture. The gospel doesn't get a fair hearing. Nobody wants to hear or understand what we have to say. But it's not just our voice that is muted. If you think about it, many of us, all of us, probably are just as fragmented as our neighbors, as our non-believing neighbors. And daily you read of Christian leaders that disqualify themselves for some moral failure or things like that. And so what happens is the church is no longer able to exercise her prophetic voice. And that is historically part of the role of the church, is to speak light into darkness and things like that. But because we can't exercise that voice, largely the Christian conscience has become muted as well. But it's not just the Christian voice and the Christian conscience that has become muted. In many ways, Christians view the world the same way everyone else does. And the idea is that we use language like this, that the world is ordinary, or the world is mundane or everyday. But that's not the way the world actually is, right? The world is mysterious, and it's beautiful, and to use the proper word, it's gift, it's sacred. And so as a result, though, the Christian imagination has become muted too. And so if you add all of this up, the reality is that for many in our culture today, Christianity is no longer viewed as plausible or desirable or both. And so that's the problem that we face. So it reminds me of this guy. Anybody know the name Leslie Newbegin? Okay, so Leslie Newbegin was a missionary that was sent from Great Britain to India. He left in 1936, his home country, went to India, ministered to Hindus for, 40 years? Yeah, still doing it. But, and then in 1974, he comes back home to Great Britain. And he realizes in the 30, 40 years that he was gone that his own sending country had become post-Christian, and that he needed to have a missionary encounter once again with his own country. And so he wrote this book called The Foolishness to the Greeks, which is actually kind of a classic book in the area of missions and evangelism and understanding culture and things like that. But in that book, he asked this question on the very first page. And I think this is actually the crucial question for all of us today, living in a post-Christian world. It's a great question. What would be involved in a missionary encounter between the gospel and the whole way of perceiving, thinking, and living that we call modern Western culture? So I would call this the crucial question of the post-Christian world. Now, of course, it's not the ultimate question, right? What's the ultimate question? What do you make of Jesus Christ? That's the ultimate question. So this is penultimate in many ways. But Newbegin understood that the gospel is never preached in a vacuum, and that there's a collective mindset. There's a collective conscience. There's actually a collective imagination to our culture that informs whether or not the gospel will be viewed as plausible or implausible, desirable or undesirable. And so I think it's really important that we think about this question, this crucial question. So what I want to do today, and like I said, we're going to do little Bible studies. I think that we can do no better than to start with Paul's example to the Greeks on Mars Hill. And so what I want to do is actually walk through that passage with you. So if you have your Bible, or if it's on your phone, or whatever, you can pull that out. I want to make 6 observations from that passage. And the reason why I want to do that, though, actually is ultimately I want to take the insight there and I want to apply it to a model for cultural engagement. So there's some really interesting payoff if you just hang with me for a few minutes as we walk through this passage, okay? So, all right, let's do that. Let's turn to it, and that's okay if you don't have access to the text. I can read most of it for you. So, context: second missionary journey. Here, Paul has been run out of Thessalonica and Berea, and he finds himself in Athens, which is, a beautiful city here. And he's waiting for his 2 friends, Timothy and Silas. So if you look at verse 16, it says, while Paul was waiting for them, that's Timothy and Silas, in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So here you have Paul venturing actually over 1,000 miles from his home, all the way to one of the most important cities of the ancient world, which is Greece, which is Athens. This is a home of all these famous people. I've already mentioned, this is Socrates, by the way, Plato and Aristotle. These are famous philosophers. There's others too. There's Epicurus and Zeno. But it wasn't just the philosophers. There's the poets, the playwrights that are there as well. So you have Menander, and then this is Aristophanes, who I mentioned wrote the comedy, The Clouds. They're all from Athens. One of actually the father of history is this guy, Thucydides. So these incredibly important people are in this incredibly important city, and Paul finds himself basically here in Athens. Now, by the time Paul arrives, though, in the first century in Athens, it had already sort of actually, one commentator puts it this way: Athens was in the late afternoon of her glory. So, the time of the philosophers had passed in many ways. The economic and commercial center of the ancient world had shifted from Athens, where it used to be, to Corinth, where Paul is headed next. Sorry that it keeps buzzing back and forth there. But Athens was still a really important cultural city and then intellectual capital of the world. So you had the very first university is right here in Athens. It's Plato's Academy. But it wasn't just cultural and the intellectual capital of the world. It was also a religious center of the ancient world. And so here's a great quote from somebody that was arriving in Athens basically at the same time that Paul was there. He said this about Athens. He said, it's more likely to meet a god or a goddess than to meet a man on the streets of Athens. Now that's actually kind of true because the statistics say that there were somewhere between 25 and 30,000 citizens, but somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 idols that lined every street corner and every marketplace, as you go walking throughout the city. So it's kind of interesting. It was the religious center of the world. So it's no wonder, back to the text, that Paul was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So that leads to our first observation. If it comes back up, there it is. We all worship that which is ultimate, right? If you think about it, okay, so they have statues everywhere in Athens. But it's no different in our own day and age either, right? We worship that which is ultimate in our lives, whether it's money or things or sports or games or food, which will come back on in a minute. We all worship that which is ultimate in our lives. And so I was made aware of this human propensity to worship. Actually, I wish I could get this thing to work. No, it's like, no. Do you want me to use the other cord? Like I can plug in on the VGI thing. Well, there it is, but I'll keep going, but I don't know why it's doing that. Whereas I first began to realize that we all worship that which is ultimate is at a Pearl Jam concert. So I hope that's okay. I was in seminary, but Pearl Jam came to Los Angeles where we were. And now you guys are a little younger than I am, but in the 1990s, grunge bands were all the rage. And this is, of course, Pearl Jam. And so my friend and I were both in seminary. He loved Pearl Jam, and he wanted to go. I wasn't a huge concert goer, but I was up for it, so we went to this concert. What was interesting about the concert, though, was the minute that Pearl Jam gets on the stage, it was like the entire auditorium begins to move, as a single organism. And we begin to sort of, move to the beat of Pearl Jam. And for about 3 hours, we're doing this. And we're singing at the top of our lungs. And it was about toward the end of this concert that I looked around to the left and the right, and I realized that I was participating in the secular equivalent of a church worship service. And I can remember Mike and I walking out of that concert very much aware of the human propensity to worship that which is ultimate. It's just how we've been wired. And of course, if you put your theology cap on, that makes sense, right? God is our creator. And so everything makes sense in relationship to our creator, right? And that's why one philosopher, Peter Crave, said that the opposite of theism isn't atheism, but idolatry. And I think he's right there because we all worship something that's ultimate in our lives. And so this is what Paul was confronted with in Athens, is the reality that there were idols everywhere. All right, so let's actually look at the text here. So Paul is confronted there. It says that he was greatly distressed. Some translations say things like this. His spirit was provoked, and he was angry. And the reason why is because he realized that idolatry robs God of the glory that was due his name. And so what does he do? Well, it spurs Paul into action. What does he do? In verse 17, he goes and shares with the Jews in the synagogue and the Greeks in the marketplace. And then in verse 18, if you look at the end, you learn what he shares about. He's sharing about Jesus and the resurrection, right? He's going out, like you guys will do here in a little bit, and sharing the gospel. Now, as he's doing that, though, in verse 18, Paul runs into there's two groups that have two different reactions to Paul. The first group asks this question in verse 18, what is this babbler? And so there's a picture of a bird that'll hopefully pop back on here in a minute. Oh, that's a cool picture. There it is. Okay. What is this babbler? And the Greek word actually literally means seed picker. And it's this idea that Paul is the kind of dilettante that walks around and takes a scrap of wisdom here and a scrap of wisdom there and then passes it off as profundity or something like that. What is this babbler? So that's the first group. The second group, actually, if you look at the end of verse 18, they think that Paul is preaching foreign gods, two gods, actually, a god named Jesus, and then this goddess, Anastasis, which is kind of interesting. Anastasis is the Greek word there for resurrection. And they're confused. They don't know, what Paul's doing here. They think he's preaching two gods, and so they invite him. Let's see if we can get the picture of the next thing here. They invite him to the Areopagus, which is in verse 19. Now, the Areopagus, an interesting history. 400 years prior to when Paul arrived, you have Socrates, who was on trial, here in the Areopagus, and he was condemned to death because he corrupted the youth and he preached foreign gods. And so it's the same place. So Paul's invited, which is so interesting. Paul's invited to the same place. Actually, we'll come back to this later in the passage. It's brilliant. He comes back and they ask him, they want to hear more. Okay? So the next observation, though, I want us to see is I want us to notice something about Paul as he begins his speech. So look at verses 22 and 23 in the text. It says, Paul stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said this. He said, "Men of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Now what you worship is something unknown, I'm going to proclaim to you." And so here we have the second observation. Paul was a student of the culture he sought to reach with the gospel. So you have this interesting phrase in verse 23. It says, looked carefully. He went out and he was looking carefully. And basically that means he's looking again and again. He's examining meticulously the city of Athens. So he didn't just sort of happen on all these altars. He went out looking for them. So he did his homework. And undoubtedly, as he was doing his homework, he would have seen these altars all over the city that had this label, to an unknown God. And he would have also heard about the plague that took place about 500 years prior to Paul. This is a horrific plague. If you go back and read the history, you can read this actually in Thucydides. This plague wiped out a third of the city. It was horrific. And while it was taking place, they would keep offering sacrifices to idol after idol. And the plague would never stop, offering sacrifices so that this idol, this god, would stop the plague. Finally, one of their own poets, a guy named Epimenides, said this. He said, "Why don't you make an altar to an unknown god and offer a sacrifice to it?" So they did that, and the plague stops. And so all over the city, you have these idols to this unknown God who stops the plague. Now, it's probably important to notice here that this points to the character of the messenger. So here we have Paul, who's morally virtuous, right? His spirit is provoked in the face of idolatry. But he's not just morally virtuous, he's actually intellectually virtuous as well, right? He looks carefully at the objects of their worship. He reasons with the Jews in the synagogue and the Greeks in the marketplace, right? And this kind of brings up an awkward question that I think it's probably appropriate to ask. Remember, we're talking about this image problem that we have as Christians. So the question is, well, could it be that part of the reason why we're so maligned and misunderstood as Christians today is because we're basically not the kinds of people that God wants us to be? And even paradoxically, could it be because we are not the kinds of people who are taking the time to understand those that we seek to reach for the gospel? And one of the things that is prevalent, there's many things that we could say, but one thing that probably needs to be said is the rampant anti-intellectualism that we find in much of Christianity and the church. And the reality is that anti-intellectualism is actually deeply anti-biblical. It's actually sin. Look at Paul. He reasons with them. He goes out and looks at their objects of worship, right? It points to the character of the messenger. All right, let's go on to the next observation. I want you to notice something else about his speech. Actually, the next three observations are about the speech. And I'm going to use some language it's actually from N.T. Wright, but I think he helps capture it. Third observation, first one about the speech. Notice that Paul affirms what he can affirm about the Athenian culture, right? He affirms the religious nature behind all the idolatry, right? He recognizes their attempt to grope after God. And so what he's doing, and you're going to see this in a minute, he's identifying common ground from which to build a bridge from Athens to Jesus and the gospel, okay? He basically says, let me tell you about this unknown God whom you worship, who heals the plague. Let me tell you the nature of who he is. Okay, next observation, number 4. Second one from the speech, though. I want you to notice how Paul outflanks their thinking, the Athenians' thinking. And this is actually brilliant. This is my favorite. There's so much in this passage. Watch him build a bridge from the unknown God who heals the plague to the God of Christianity. He says in verse 20, is your creator. He says, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by hands. So this God whom you worship is unknown, who heals the plague is your creator. But he's not just your creator, he's your sustainer. Look at verse 25. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. So this God whom you worship is unknown, who heals the plague, is your creator and your sustainer. But he's not just that, he's your ordainer. Look at verse 26. From one man he made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he determined the time set for them and the exact place where they should live. So here you have this interesting reference from one man. It's this reference to Adam. And it's the idea that all people find their roots in this creator God, whom you worship is unknown, who heals the plague, who's your creator and sustainer and ordainer. And then we arrive in verse 27. He says, therefore, or so that, therefore you should seek God. It says, verse 27, God did this so that men should seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. Okay, so in verse 27, you have a very clear articulation of Paul's theology of what's called natural revelation. It's this idea, that we can see and understand who God is through that which he has made. Now, it's actually really interesting. There's this word here. He says that you are to seek him and perhaps reach out. I'm reading out of the NIV. Some translations say grope for and find God. Now that in the Greek, the word there is the exact same word that you find in this story from Homer. Anybody read Homer's Odyssey? I know my kids have to read it in high school. Maybe you did too. But you're probably familiar a little bit with the story of the Cyclops. But what's interesting about this story, so if you don't know the story, Odysseus and his men are trying to get back to their home after the Trojan War. And they find themselves on this island with these one-eyed monsters, these Cyclopses. And one of them had captured them, and he was basically keeping them as prisoners in his cave. And Odysseus, who is a wise and kind of military genius, devises this plan where he gets the Cyclops drunk and then spears that eye in his drunkenness. And as you read that story, at that moment when they blind him by spearing him in the eye, Homer writes how the Cyclops was reaching out and groping around to try to capture Odysseus and his men. What's interesting, the very same word is the word that Paul uses here. And he's basically saying, in our sin, we are as blind as the blinded Cyclops. Yet still, God, creation is here. And we are under obligation to find him and to seek him, even if we can't see him. And then we arrive at my favorite part of this passage, verse 28. Now, to understand verse 28, I need to just do a little philosophy. I promise I won't freak you out on philosophy. But let me just say this. There were three questions that captivated the early Greek imagination. And they're questions that don't exactly capture our hearts and minds, but they did for the ancients. And the three questions were this. What is being? So what is the nature of reality, ultimate reality? What is life? And then what is motion? Think about change. What explains change? Now what's interesting, the very first philosopher is this guy named Thales. Thales said, hey, he basically answered these three questions this way. Hey, all is water. What is being? It's water. And then he used that to answer all the other questions. He was looking at it, things that have life have water, and change is water. And it's not a bad first pass if you think about it, because he was staring out at the Mediterranean Sea. But then as things go here, the next philosopher, this guy named Heraclitus, he says, no, it's not water. Fundamental reality is change. And so he famously said, you cannot step in the same river twice. And so I'll just let you think on that for a moment. But Heraclitus answered those three fundamental questions in light of change. But then, as you can imagine, the next guy comes around, Parmenides, and he says, no, change is an illusion. Fundamental reality is this mysterious, eternal stuff. And, he answered those three questions in light of this. And you can see this dialectic basically going all the way through Greek philosophy, all the way to Paul. And then we arrive at verse 28, and look at what Paul says. For in him we live and move and have our being. In other words, Paul's saying, those fundamental questions that you've been asking since the beginning of Greek philosophy? It's him. It's the God whom you worship is unknown, who heals the plague, who is your creator and sustainer and ordainer. He's the answer to these fundamental questions. Paul has outflanked their thinking. By the way, this quote is a quote from that same poet, Epimenides. And so Paul agrees with their poet up to a point and then reinvests it with new meaning. The last part of verse 28, it says, as some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. There he's quoting a Stoic philosopher named Aratus. So it'd be like you or I quoting from Pearl Jam or more contemporary stuff to to make a case for the gospel. That's what Paul is doing effortlessly as he outflanks their thinking. It's brilliant. Okay, so cool. All right, let's finish up the passage and make two more observations, and then we're going to apply it. All right, next observation number 5, third one about the speech, though. Paul confronts their rank idolatry within their midst. So, beginning in verse 29, he says this: "Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by man's design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man." So here he's brought them to Jesus. Remember the ultimate question, what do you make of Jesus? And he has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead. Okay. This is pretty interesting. So what he's done here is he's moved the conversation out of the Greek mindset to a distinctly Judeo-Christian mindset here. And he basically is affirming the spiritual hunger behind their idolatry, but now he's saying that idolatry is inconsistent with belief in a personal God. And he begins to introduce to them the idea of a moral accountability to deity, which is that was something pretty unfamiliar to the Greek mindset at the time. And then he challenges them to repent, to literally change your mind, and he introduces them to the one who stands at the center of our faith, Jesus Christ. Now, this is what's so amazing about this. Remember, he's at the Areopagus, right? So there's a picture again of the Areopagus. So here's Paul, 50s AD. He's standing in the Areopagus, and so here's the mythic founding. There's kind of a story of how the Areopagus was founded, and all the Greeks knew it. And you find that story in go back to the ancient playwrights. It's actually a different playwright, a guy named Aeschylus. And he wrote a little trilogy called the Odyssey trilogy. And in the second one of those, a little play called The Eumenides, you find the story of the mythic founding of the Areopagus. So this is what's so interesting about it. In the mythic founding of the Areopagus, you have, so basically right before democracy, is born there in Athens, you have Apollo, the god Apollo, and he's standing before these three furies, these goddesses, on trial for murder. And this is what Apollo says at the mythic founding of the Areopagus, the first democratic jury. He says, "Once a man is slain, once blood is shed, there will be no resurrection." Now here's Paul, 500 years later, and he says, if there's no resurrection, then who was that appeared to me on the road to Damascus? It's actually I don't know if Paul knew about the mythic founding, but it's really interesting if you kind of know the history here. Paul proclaims in the very place where Apollo says, once a man is slain, there'll be no resurrection. He proclaims Jesus Christ resurrected. Okay, last observation, since we should finish the passage, and then we'll apply. The last observation is basically that his speech had mixed results. 32 to the end. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, and others said, "We want to hear again on this subject." At that, Paul left the council. A few men became followers of Paul and believed. Among them were Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. Okay, so you basically see three responses to Paul. Some sneered and mocked, some wanted to hear more, and some believed. Now, the question that immediately arises, actually in a lot of commentaries on this passage, is why did Luke include the mixed response to this speech? Some commentators say that this shows that Paul's speech was a failure. And so by the time he gets to Corinth, he's given up on philosophy. Philosophy becomes foolishness to the Greeks or something like that. I don't think that that's why Luke includes the mixed results, and and Paul does not give up on philosophy after he leaves here. I think that Luke includes the mixed responses here for two reasons. The first is this: there will likely always be mixed responses to the Gospels, right? If Paul had mixed responses, well, guess what? So will you. So will I when we try to share the Gospel. Some will sneer and mock, some will want to hear more, and some will believe. And it reminds us that our job is simply to be faithful witnesses for Christ. But it's the Holy Spirit's job to convict them of their sin and to draw them to himself and so on. So our job is to understand those we seek to reach. That's part of what it means to be faithful witnesses. But it's the Holy Spirit's job to bring them to him. The second reason, though, why I think Luke includes the fact that there's mixed results is because it actually reminds us that there's a deeper question. Remember I said the ultimate question that we want everybody to ask is, what do you make of Jesus Christ? Well, C.S. Lewis actually helps us realize that there's a more foundational question. And that's the question, what does Jesus Christ make of us? Right? And here, as I think about this, the answer is that he thinks a great deal of us, right? So much that he gave all of himself so that we can have life. He pursues us, and he gave himself up so that we can be whole. And so the mixed response to Paul's speech, I think, reminds us that we're aliens in a fallen world, and that our identity comes from what Christ says of us, right? And so our job is to faithfully present to others. Now, what's so beautiful about this passage, I think, is now that you've kind of seen the big picture here, is notice how Paul identifies a starting place and then effortlessly builds a bridge using reason and imagination, right? Quoting from the poets and the philosophers of his day, so that they can ask that ultimate question, what do you make of Jesus Christ? He's built a bridge from his Athens to Jesus and the gospel. And so what I want to do now is, here's the payoff. I want to give you from that, I think, a model for how we, in our day, can think about engaging those in our culture, right? Because like Paul in Athens, we in many ways live in a culture where people hold beliefs very different from us. So one thing that I think we should do is to understand, the first thing I should say is that we want to learn to understand our Athens. Then we want to identify starting points from which to build bridges from our Athens to Jesus and the gospel. And then we want to consider barriers that might be addressed along the way. So let me just, in about 5 minutes, give you the model, and then I think we'll have a little time that we can talk about it. So here's a suggestion. Let's begin with that first idea of understanding our Athens. Okay, remember Newbegin's question. He says, what is the modern Western world's way of perceiving, thinking, and living? Let's use those three words to understand our Athens a bit. So what's our dominant way of perceiving in our culture today? And I'm talking about the West. And the word I would use is disenchanted. Our world is disenchanted. In other words, the world is no longer seen in its proper light. We use words like everyday or mundane or ordinary. But again, that's not what the world is, right? It's beautiful, it's mysterious. Lewis said that the proper word is holy. It's gift, right? As a culture, we're under a spell, taking for granted life and beauty and goodness and truth and all of them instead of seeing this as a gift. So disenchanted. We could talk about that. Second, what is our whole culture's way of thinking? In a word, I would say the word is sensate. What I mean by that is that we're fixed on the physical, the sensory, the material. One of my favorite lines in C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters, if you've read this, if you know this book, it's a fictional dialogue between a senior devil and a junior devil. But the senior devil says to the junior devil, your business is to fix their minds on the stream of experience, because in doing that, you'll keep them from considering universal matters, right? And as a culture, we are fixed on that stream of experience with our heads down, pretty much. We're sensate. And then the last word, what is our whole culture's way of living? Well, in a word, hedonistic. Hedonistic. We move from one episode of pleasure to another. Filling ourselves with these bite-sized packets of pleasure, but always longing for more. In fact, Lewis, since I'm thinking of him, he, in the Chronicles of Narnia, remember Edmund, and he wanted the Turkish delights? Well, for Lewis, and so once he had one, that's all he wanted, right? So what is a Turkish delight for Lewis? Well, it represented something that gives us an immediate sensual payoff, but ultimately ends up enslaving us, right? That describes our culture. We're addicted to Turkish delights, and you can probably name them, right? Okay, so that's a little bit, and you'd probably want to say a lot more, but at least this will help us begin to understand our culture. So with that, how do we build a bridge from our Athens to Jesus and the gospel? Well, here's something that I found really helpful. Peter Kraft, who's a philosopher, talks about three prophets of the soul. And this idea that God has given us a mind, or reason, God has given us our conscience, and He's given us an imagination. And each of these is on a quest for the object of their longing. So what does reason long for? What do you guys think? What is the object of our quest with the mind? What's that? Yeah, truth, understanding, good. Conscience, what do you think our conscience longs for?
What's right?
Good. Yeah, what's right? Goodness. So more broadly, goodness. Okay, what about the imagination? What do we long for there? Beauty. Now, if we put our theology caps on, what is the source of goodness, truth, and beauty? Well, the answer is Christ. So here's an interesting suggestion. These are deep longings of the human heart. Everyone longs for goodness, truth, and beauty. And God has given us these guides to help us along the way. So here's the proposal. What if we use those universal human longings, even though they're muted, what if we use those to build bridges to the Gospels? So here's the starting points, just like Paul. Remember, for Paul, it was this worship of the unknown God. My proposal is, let's use these universal longings, and then let's build bridges through these three prophets of the soul. So let me just say a little bit more about each one of these and how I'm thinking about it briefly. So, this longing for truth. So Aristotle famously said this. He said that all men desire to know. All humans desire to know. And I think that that's right. We have deep within us this longing to know the truth about ourselves and the world. But here's the problem. Given disenchantment, we have that longing for knowledge has been suppressed. Many of you are bored in your classes, right? That longing for truth has been suppressed. And so our job as apologists, as evangelists, as cultural apologists, is to awaken that longing for truth. And we do that through giving arguments, through showing evidence, just like Paul did, proof that Jesus rose from the dead, things like that. Okay? With respect to the longing for goodness, this is really interesting. If you think about it, Blaise Pascal said this. He said that deep within us, he said it this way, there's a memory of a wisp, of an echo of a time when man was truly happy. And in other words, deep within us, we have this memory of this time when things were as they ought to be. And so I kind of parsed this longing for goodness into three components. We long for justice, right? We long for the world made right. We long for wholeness, that all of our being would be, whole and not fragmented. And then we long for significance, right? That we want our lives to count. That's part of this longing for goodness that all of us share. And of course, as followers of Christ, we can help in all of those areas, right? Because living a life under the banner of Christ, we find that happiness is actually found in union with God and not things of this world. And then, the most underutilized, but most important in our culture today, the longing for beauty. I think this is an incredible starting point from which to build a bridge to the Gospels. We're drawn to beauty. Plato famously said, beauty evokes desire. C.S. Lewis said at age 6, his first experience of beauty, he said he became a votary of the blue flower. Okay, so what does that mean? Votary, follower, devotee. What's the blue flower? Well, for Lewis, the blue flower was a symbol from German Romantic literature that was symbolic of something of intense longing that's just beyond the horizon that propels us forward, but we can never quite get it. And so he said he was a votary of the blue flower from that first experience at age 6 with beauty. And this is why, of course, and the imagination, this longing for beauty is nourished through the imagination. So this is why we're drawn to literature. Think about the stories we love to watch and read, the music, the art, and so on. They awaken within us, and I think they actually set us on a quest for the ultimate longing of our heart, which is Christ. Okay? So I guess I'm suggesting that we have 3 starting points that and 3 planks that we can use to build a bridge to the gospel. Now let me just complete the picture, then we'll be done. We also want to respond to barriers along the way. And so there's basically 2 kinds of barriers, what I would call internal barriers and then what I would call external barriers. Internal barriers are stuff we need to get right on. External barriers are things out there. For example, I say one internal barrier is that we need to see Jesus for who he actually is, as smart, as brilliant. I think often as Christians, we tend to think Jesus is kind of silly. And let me switch the language because that sounds odd. We tend to give Jesus moral and spiritual authority, but when it comes to intellectual matters, we don't think that Jesus possesses intellectual virtue, right? So we go to the scientist, or the man or the woman in the white lab coat for knowledge, or to the Cohen brothers, or Oprah for or Hollywood or something. But we don't go to pastors and theologians for knowledge anymore. And so largely what happens, and this is part of the anti-intellectualism, we just don't view Jesus for who he actually is. He is beautiful as our Redeemer. But he's also smart, right? He's the Logos. In Colossians 2:3, it says, in Christ are hidden all treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Jesus is smart. He's brilliant. Externally, the idea of seeing Christianity as a public truth. There's this idea out there that religious faith is blind and subjective and things like that. And so that would be an example of something we want to learn how to address. Now, the hopeful result, though, and so I'm giving you a model for cultural apologetics, but ultimately the hopeful result is that we would work to reestablish the Christian voice, reestablish the Christian conscience, and reestablish the Christian imagination so that the gospel can be viewed once again as reasonable and desirable. So 2 other slides will be done. I just gave you chapter 1 from this book. It's coming out in 12 days. So you can order it right now on Amazon if you'd like. But I unpack that entire model in that book if you're interested. And then secondly, if you want to follow, there's a group of us that have launched this new ministry called the Two Tasks Institute. You can find us on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. Follow us, like us. Tons of videos, tons of content. We've got a podcast and other books that you can, if you're interested in. Really, we're asking this question: how do we show the world that Christianity is not just reasonable, which we do fairly well as apologetics, but also desirable? In other words, that Christianity is not just true to the way the world is, but it's true to the way the world ought to be as well. It's beautiful and good as well. Okay? How are we doing? Like 5 minutes? Do you have any thoughts or questions that you guys want to talk about? And I'll put the model back on.
What was the name of that group again?
The Two Tasks Institute. And it's twotasksinstitute.org. And you can just follow us on Facebook or Instagram too. The easiest way.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So whenever you're bridging, what are some questions that you might ask, or how would you bring it up?
Yeah, I think one of the best questions, so it's really interesting, the very first question Jesus asks in the Gospel of John is, what do you want? And he's asking that of the prospective disciples. That's a great question, right? We are desiring animals. What do you want? And then as you begin to explore that, we start with surface desires, but the deeper we go, you're going to land on truth and goodness and beauty and love and justice. And then right beneath that, the deepest heart longing, which is God, Jesus, the source of all that. So I think what do you want is great. With the imagination, listen to I would encourage us to, the stories and the music that really resonates with our heart and does something to us and those that we're around, I would explore that. What is it about that that's evocative to you? I found beauty to be really, in this day and age, and image to be really helpful for awakening and setting us on a journey to Christ, ultimately. Does that help a little bit? Yeah, go ahead. Do you want to ask a follow-up?
So with beauty, how would you go about that?
I would in the shows that we watch,
Just ask them about
yeah, I would actually be intentional and just have conversations. Or in the things that we listen to, what is it about that?
Oh, then ask them. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Because so like Lewis says, it's not the beauty that we see in the book, he says, but it's the beauty that we long through the book. And so we have to help them see that it's not the beautiful things that we long for ultimately, it's the beauty through that. And so I love, there's this, last thing, there's this guy, Dostoevsky wrote a book called The Idiot. And in there's a character that says, beauty will save the world. And I've always wondered, that's kind of an odd statement. Beauty will save the world. I'm thinking, well, maybe money, maybe military might, but beauty? But the more I think about it, always go back to something that Augustine said in the Confessions. He said this of Jesus. He said, you are the beauty of all beautiful things. And then he said, you are the good of all good things. And I would just add, you are the truth to which all true things point. That's what I think we're doing when we help people think about the beautiful things in our lives. Well, it's actually the thing through there that we want to point them to. Yeah.
Yeah. So for a more real practical way, is this something that you would use in more of a relationship that you're building long term?
Yeah, I think my idea is that this kind of frees us up a little bit. We want to walk the plank of reason, but we want to do it in such a way that it actually helps people understand the gospel. And so we live in this post-Christian world, and so we use words like sin, and Jesus wants to forgive you and save your soul. And people don't know what sin, save, and soul is. And so the imagination, Lewis calls that the organ of meaning. And so if we can help people understand what sin and soul and forgiveness mean, well, then then the gospel is going to get a fair hearing. And so I guess what I'm saying is that we should learn to reason imaginatively and be really creative in telling the gospel. I've started doing spoken word poetry and actually producing some of it because it connects with our culture in a way that's, I mean, it's still reason, but it's evoking imagination too. So yeah, it just frees us up to, I mean, we have to give arguments. I'm a philosopher, I love arguments, but let's do it in a way that people actually can understand. So.